She's, she's you can't hello. Say hello. Say hello. Boom. This is the one that does not like to be held. Okay. Good morning. Today we are having a fairly nuts and bolts lecture on the structure of the Soviet Union. Something we haven't kind of put off, but my goal is that you emerge from this just having a better sense of the geography here and the geography and the component parts. There's a really big backstory here. But wait, let me pause on that and just say, so here we are this week. This Friday, we have our second test coming up. I'll say a few more words about that on Wednesday. But as per usual, what do you need to know for the test? You are responsible for the material in the lectures, and you're responsible for the material in assigned reading. I mean, not to not to uh, ridiculous idea level of granularity. For example, I'm not going to ask you something like, what does Serhiy Plohi say on page 200 of Yalta or something like that? But I want you to have a real command of the facts. And again, I here invite you to take a look, relook at the lectures, not all of which are posted, but you'll see again, and also to use that freeze. That freeze, when I say freeze, I mean the chapters in the volume Russia History edited by Freeze. And these are really kind of information rich, pretty solid narrative outline. And when you look back at the titles of, each lecture, that's a clue into, oh, what am I expected to, be able to say something about? That can sort of be a good way for you to prepare. Look at every lecture and say, what if I was asked to say something about that? What did I learn? What would I have to say? Um, okay, the Soviet Union in the post-World War II, structures and nationalities. Now, again, the Soviet Union is an entity that exists from December 30th, 1922 to December 26th, 1991. And it came to effectively exist on what had been the territory of the Russian Empire. And what I had started to say there is that there's a really big backstory here in that the Russian Empire, in many ways, came to exist on much territory that had been briefly united under what we think of as the Mongol Empire. The Russian Empire existed, it, uh, um, it grew, bre- uh, um, it grew very slowly. I'm thinking here that I'd like to show you some other pictures, but rather than mm, rather than delve into that, um, yeah, we'll just stay with this picture right now. Um, so, and it Mongol Empire exists, it more or less disintegrates, and the Russian Empire begins to constitute itself. And in large part, the story of the Russian Empire, in 10 words or less, is that it expands tremendously over Eurasian space from the 15 from the late 15th century up until the 19th century. And it reaches its greatest extent in the 19th century when it extends down into here and annexes Central Asia, and that territory is gained in the 1860s. And also, it has Alaska, which it claims in the 1740s and ends up selling in the wake of the Crimean War in the mid 19th century. So the greatest territorial extent of the Russian Empire is reached in the 19th century. And then the Soviet Union is reconstituted mostly on that territory. Now, In the Western borderlands, we've just talked in a very brief way about World War II. In World War II, the Soviet Union will acquire western parts of Ukraine that were never ever part of the Russian Empire. In some ways, one historian, Roman Sporlik, I think, said, "Oh, and this was a bit of an Achilles heel for the Soviet Union in that those western areas of Ukraine were had no sense of being a part of the Russian Empire. And even now, Lviv is what has been considered to be a real hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism. Like, so many people there. What are we doing as part of this Soviet empire, which is kind of a reconstituted Russian empire? Okay, but so, but nuts and bolts. And what I want, so I want you to come away with this with some sense of the structure of the Soviet Union. You know, what are the republics? And we want to talk a little bit about nationalities policy. How did Soviet leadership think about nationalities? And I want you to have this idea on your radar screen, the friendship of the peoples. You know, Marx was a critic of imperialism. Um, Imperialism was another way of kind of a state and geographic exploitation of peoples. And so it's not something that is going to exist in socialism. So, well, if you want to have, so if you're anti-empire, but you end up reconstituting and taking control through a civil war of all these peoples that many of whom have explicitly said, "Oh, we get to choose. Okay, we're out." What do you do? How do you talk about that? And the way the Soviet Union talked about it was a friendship of the peoples. And this right here is a statue at in a place called Vidinha, which was on the outskirts of Moscow. And when I worked in a drafty warehouse for years, I would get off at the metro and I would walk through this kind of park of economic achievements. And I would go past this statue, not every day. On some days, I'd have to take a little bit of a detour. And and this has all 15 different people representing the 15 different republics that made up the Soviet Union that were joined together in a friendship of the peoples. It's not imperialism, it's friendship. Um, Now, when the Soviet Union was formed, it consisted of 7 republics. The Russian Republic contained 92% of the population and was 72% of the USSR as a whole. When we talk about the end of the Soviet Union and what happens immediately in its wake, that's important. That we have supposedly this voluntary happy union of the republics, but the Russian Republic by far is territorially and demographically the dominant one. So, um, so here's Russia, for example. You can see how big it is, the administrative divisions of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, just to show, it is so massive, it stretches 11 time zones. I don't know if you saw in the paper this weekend, there was an article that Russia has announced it has a missile that can travel very far distances. And I think it said it has a missile that can carry nuclear weapons. So approaching an announcement of having tactical nuclear weapons. If before the nuclear game was one of mutually assured destruction, where we have big bombs that will kind of wreck the whole world, how does the game change if now there are little nuclear weapons that can just really poison an area that's more confined for centuries to come? We'll talk more about nuclear power when we get to Chernobyl. But at any rate, they announced kind of their test, and I was wondering and how many thousands of miles it flew, and I was wondering where it was, recognizing that certainly under their own territory they could fly quite a distance. So, three of the republics of the Soviet Union are what we call the Baltic states, and the Baltic states are there in western, just west of Russia, and they are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. If one way I think of it is if you Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're in alphabetical order, north to south. They're remarkably small countries. This is in an the Baltics are in the last corner of Europe to be Christianized. Even into the 14th century, you still have pagan rulers. The Gedimines are a dynasty, and they're fascinating. They convert to Christianity, and then a next generation converts away from Christianity back to their traditional paganism. And so we see apostasy. The final crusade is launched into Europe to convert these pagans. It's historically it was for centuries kind of attached when it became attached to anyone. It was attached to Sweden and then the Germanic states, and then became incorporated in the Russian Empire. The Baltics are somewhat interesting because they have a large Germanic population, and this population was by and large wealthier, wealthy-ish relative to much of the population, and they had institutions of learning, and they had links to the Hanseatic trade, eh, um, the Hanseatic League in the Middle Ages, and then the trade through the Baltics to, yeah. So if here's the Baltics, this is a different type of map, and you come through the Danish sound tolls, and then here you are to Europe, where you have, Hamburg and all this German trade. So the Baltics um, were maybe relatively wealthier with more educated people. And it became the case that in the late Russian Empire, you had a tremendous amount of generals, officers, people that rose to high ranks in the Russian imperial structure came from the Baltics. So, if you're thinking in terms of oppression or not oppressed, these were in large part places that um, they did okay in the upper strata among them did pretty well in the Russian imperial structure because they had so much to bring to it and prove to be um, you know educated administrators. Not all by a long shot. Um, they the republics, so they're very small, um, but these republics were, now in our security, they're so crucial. They quickly became part of NATO when they had the opportunity because in they were not in the immediate wake of the Russian Revolution. They became independent and were just incorporated back after World War II, after 1945. And so they lost, they had that taste of freedom that left a much stronger independent streak in the vast majority of the population in the latter decades of the Soviet Union. And to be sure, when the Soviet Union starts falling apart, it's the Baltics that are among the first to say, we're out of here. And when you watch Journey to Russia, you'll see one of the debates happens in a Baltic state. And you'll notice they encounter a very different environment than they encounter when they're down there in Volgograd. So those are the Baltics. Then moving to the western borderlands, Here's Belarusia and Ukraine. And these are um, very important republics. And Belarusia, Ukraine, and Russia are the three republics that are predominantly Slavic. And with much orthodoxy. Although, as you get into the Western lands, Belarus and Ukraine both had a lot of Jews, most of whom were annihilated in World War II. They also had a, an amount, although a minority, and more in Ukraine, I'm more talking about Ukraine here, of what has been known as Greek Catholic. And the Greek Catholic Church is a religion that, in my view, essentially constitutes a split that happened for political reasons in the late 16th century. Without going into much detail at all, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was multi-confessional but predominantly Catholic, and a very big, powerful state in the 16th century, recognized that Muscovy to its east was encroaching, was an aggressive, ambitious state. And it also recognized that, and it lived in a world where religion very much shapes people's identities. And so it understood that with Moscow having one of the highest, being kind of the highest office in the Orthodox Church with a patriarchate, that many people looked to the religious leadership in Moscow for leadership. You know, our nation is founded in the post-Reformation Enlightenment era rationalism, where the separation between church and state is a fundamental principle. The 16th century has none of that. I mean, it's in the churn of the revolution, in large part, is hitting Western Europe already. Much less of that churn in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that seems to kind of do okay with religious diversity in ways that Western Europe didn't during this time period. But there was this recognition that if so many of our people look to Moscow for religious leadership, that's a disadvantage. And so they created, with the Union of Brest in 1599, there was created a Greek Catholic Church where basically they made this deal and they said, we will look to the Pope as our religious leader, and everything else can stay the same. We're not really going to change anything fundamental about orthodoxy and how you practice and what you hear at Mass and what songs get sung, what icons you venerate. Nothing, but we're going to follow, the Roman rite now. And this creates the Greek Catholic Church. It's a fascinating history. And so you have a good amount of people in Ukraine that subscribe to that faith. Okay, leaving just kind of a few comments here about, the flavor, character, some basic characteristics of these places that we're talking about. So if here we have, the Baltics, and here we have Belarusia and Ukraine. Now I want to come down here to the Caucasus. And the Caucasus consists of kind of three countries. So the three countries that make up the Caucasus that were part of the Soviet Union are Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And Georgia, you might all have some awareness of, because in 2008, there was a short war in Georgia over the territory of Ossetia. Now, so in the Caucasus, we have three countries. Those are republics. I'm just talking in structural terms here. And then there are within within Russia, you have some autonomous republics regions. And these are the ones that I'll just put on your radar screen. Chechnya, Ossetia, Dagestan are three of them. And so here's a map. Here's Russia. Here's Georgia. It overlooks, it abuts the Black Sea at some level. Here's Azerbaijan, very, very ancient society. It abuts the Caspian Sea. And here is Armenia, kind of a fascinating mix of kind of Catholicism and Judaism and kind of a Christian bastion that borders here Turkey and Iran. Now, kind of going way back, Iran was before we thought was the Persian Empire, and this is a Muslim entity, and a Muslim entity that its leadership was more Shiite, and Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire, also a Muslim entity, but of the Sunni tradition. The vast majority of Muslims are from the Sunni tradition, and Shiite. It was a split, early in the early centuries of Islam over lines to Muhammad. Just leave it at that. I know all this deep, deep history, and so just to make a long, long story short, Turkey and Iran, Persia and the Ottomans often fought with each other. They're both empires of different natures. And Armenia and Georgia were these two Christian places. I talked to you before how Georgia has some of the oldest Christianity on earth coming from over here. If I were to come off this map in the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where Jerusalem, the Holy Land was, and you had monks going out into the desert, came up into these mountains. And that's how kind of they've been there since the fourth century. With a somewhat isolated brand of Christianity. But so these Christian places looked as early as the 1500s to Muscovy to say, hey, you're Christian and we're surrounded by and threatened by, these Islamic powers to the south. Can you help us? Can you give us aid? Let's be friends. And even Ivan IV in the 16th century marries a princess from a Kabardinian princess from Georgia. Azerbaijan, a different deal, very old tradition, both kind of pagan and Islamic. And around this bend where the Caucasus Mountains ends along the shore, you actually have a good amount of Islamic populations up here. This border now, you see this political border of Russia. It wasn't like that for many, many centuries, although mountain ranges create a kind of border of their own, which is why the Caucasus, if you talk to someone that studies the Caucasus, one of the first things they'll talk to you about is the immense diversity in this relatively small geographic area. And that is something that, to make a kind of generalization across time, we find in mountain regions. If you're traveling across a plain that's flat and straight, it's easy enough to cover distance. But in the Caucasus, you've got huge mountains. You've got a really big pass that you have to go over to even drop down into the next valley. And so the populations tend to remain quite isolated. I've had the tremendous privilege to climb Mount Elbrus, the largest mountain in Europe. And as you move through the Caucasus into some of the valleys, mountaineers that have been there a long time will say, it's amazing. From one valley to the next, people will speak a different language. They will have different religious traditions, different kind of syncretism of, Islam and Christian and other pagan traditions. And it's really a remarkable place. And so, and I think in simple terms, it's that way. You find that sort of concentrated diversity because of the difficulty in climbing high mountains. And boy, those high mountain valleys are non-trivial to traverse. So those are just a few words about the Caucasus. It's here in the Caucasus that in the 19th century, Russia fights among its most brutal imperial wars. Um, that's all I'll say right now, because we'll come back to we'll talk more about that when we talk about the wars in Chechnya that that launch Putin's presidency in many ways. All right, now let's move into Central Asia. So here, Central Asia, and there are five republics to know about. Kazakhstan is the biggest one. Kyrgyzstan, it to the east and south, is a country that is 80% mountainous. The Tajikistan is south of that. And if in Kyrgyzstan, in large part, you find people of a kind of Mongolian Turkic tradition. As you get into Tajikistan, and notice the proximity to Iran, you have more of a Persian inflected culture and history. The Tajik language is closer to Farsi, the Persian language, than it is to Turkish. And we're coming into a tremendously kind of complex demographic, ethnic, linguistic world down here in Central Asia. Uzbekistan is another very large republic. In my first book, I I provide a case study of Muslim merchants that migrated into the Russian Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries. And Russia very much valued them as merchants that have connections and can kind of supply goods. And these people were called Bukharans. And Bukhara and Samarkand were big trading towns, trading oases down here in Central Asia. That's just a word about Uzbekistan. And also in the northern part, the Aral Sea, which this map kind of is an old map, and because now you see an Aral Sea that's so large. The Aral Sea is a tragic story of desiccation in large part due to modern farming. So much water was irrigated from it in the 20th century to fund the cotton production that came online big time in Uzbekistan in the 20th century, that sea has essentially disappeared. And it's not just the loss of water that's been the problem. We might delve a little bit farther into that. And then here's Turkmenistan, a very is in large part arid place on the southern part of the southern Caspian. And I want to just share one quick anecdote. In Albuquerque, I had very good friends that were a couple. She was from Russia near the Volga, and he was from Turkmenistan. And he had kind of pretty much lived his life in Ashgabat down here in Turkmenistan. And they were both, super duper students and got an education and came to UNM and had research jobs at UNM. And this is how I came to know them. But one summer, they came to visit us in Alaska. And they came to Alaska in the summer and froze because it was, even in the summer, it's pretty cold. And so, fortunately, we have all these. We actually were in the South, and they just went to our house in Alaska and stayed there. And they said, "Oh my gosh, we're freezing cold." And we said, "Well, go get sweaters and coats, and there's everything you need there." And sure enough, they did. And so now we have all these pictures of them in our winter gear. From their summer vacation. And it was really kind of funny because here you have this, man from Turkmenistan. He's grown up in a very southern place and then moved to Albuquerque. It gets cold, but it's hot in the summer. And then went to Alaska in the summertime. And he even said, I had no idea what I was in for. And it occurred to me that he was born and raised in the Soviet Union. And usually when we think of Russia, and like I said, Russia sort of holds this predominant place in the imagination of the Soviet Union. So you would think a Soviet citizen knew cold and was accustomed to cold. But here was an example of someone that had very little exposure to cold northern places. And for me, it was a little bit of this check of, when we think of Russia and associated immediately with cold and Arctic places, with respect to the empire and the Soviet Union, there's exceptions to that, and down here in Central Asia. Okay, now just a few quick words about Central Asia. The All of these republics that I've just named for you, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, those words are effectively products of the Soviet Union. That is to say, we didn't have these sorts of national boundaries on this space when it was part of the Russian Empire. Here's a very old map, kind of from the Russian Empire. And this whole region was generally referred to as Turkestan. It's a Russian imposed name. People on the area aren't calling themselves, they wouldn't tell you, oh, I'm from Turkestan. This area might have been called Transoxiana. I mean, it's a very, very old place. We even, Alexander the Great in the third century even kind of got somewhere into, well, we're not quite sure, but there's, built cities in Uzbekistan and his armies got that far. So you do have these places that are, ancient trading places. And even before much of this territory became Muslim in about the, 12th and 13th centuries, they have ancient traditions of being fire worshippers. Sogdians, for example, were the people of Central Asia. They were traders that went as far as China. So we're talking about a part of the world with deep, deep civilizational history, in places like Bukhara. The Sogdians were there even before the Muslims were there, many centuries before the Russians got there. And then beyond those Central Asian places, you have a good amount of steppes, and then here's mountains. And so here is, a Mongol settlement with, with kind of more modern tents and things as well. Just a picture perched around more traditional Mongol yurt settlements of the pastoral people that lived in these mountains. And in the summers, they would go up into mountain valleys where there were good grasses that they could kind of get to in the summers. But in the winters, those areas are covered with snow and ice, and they would descend into valleys and plains and live that sort of a kind of seasonal nomadic life. Is much of what, people of Kazakhstan and, over here into Xinjiang and these steppes of Russia, the kind of life ways that they knew. In some ways, the whole point here is just to put on your radar screen in a real superficial way the tremendous diversity of these spaces. Now, so maybe this is a good time to to kind of start delving into nationalities policy, or let me, so there's 15 republics in there's 15 republics in the Soviet Union that come to be. As I said, when the Soviet Union is first formed in 1922, there's just 7, but they'll gradually incorporate other republics. And so, kind of to review, you have the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I describe these places as thriving, technologically advanced. now they're all democracies and they all have a prickly relationship with Russia. For example, Estonia, like in 2007, Moscow launched major cyber attacks that pretty much shut down the Estonian banking system. It's quite frightening stuff. And then in Eastern Europe, you have three more republics: Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And as we know, Russia and Ukraine are currently involved in a war. And Belarus, on the other hand, Belarusia has kept very close ties with Moscow. It's had, the same leader, Lukashenko, for years. And I've never been to Belarus, but people say if you want to see the Soviet Union, take a trip to Minsk. It is like you are walking back in time. And then Moldova over here to the west is, closer to Western Europe and trying to, if I dare say, be more Western. Down here, we have the Caucasus, three republics there: Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And this is an area with oil, so it has garnered significant attention from the West, and we could do a mini course on the pipeline politics of this region in the last 30 years, but we'll skip that right now. I'll just point out for you that, so Georgia, it declared, when the Russian Empire, when the Tsar abdicated, it declared its independence in 1918, and it was attacked and seized and brought into the fold by 1921. Azerbaijan, it also established itself as a republic in 1918. Turkey actually seized it while Russia is totally in chaos. So it kind of goes over to Turkey, and then the Brits seized Azerbaijan from Turkey, and then the Bolsheviks won it back from the Brits in April 1920. Very kind of complicated history, has much to do with oil, and it was incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1920. And now it sort of has a president, but the presidency has passed from father to son. We'll see what happens there. Okay, and then Central Asia. Central Asia is the part of the Soviet Union that was the latest being incorporated. Kazakhstan is incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1936. Uzbekistan is established as a republic in 1924, and Turkmenistan is established. Well, it's the Turkmenistan kind of gets drawn on the map in 1921, and it becomes part of Russia in 1925, and after that, kind of gets reinstituted as its own republic. Again, lots of these complicated histories, not so important to know the details of Turkmenistan's genesis, but know that it isn't part of the original member of the Soviet Union. Kyrgyzstan is established only in 1936. Tajikistan over here is in 1924, calls itself an autonomous republic within Uzbekistan. And then in 1929, it's made into its own republic. And as I said before, this republic, it's kind of it differs significantly from, say, Kyrgyzstan in that it has more roots in Persian language and ethnicity. And so it's a bit of an outlier to the other Central Asian republics. Although there's Persian influence in Uzbekistan as well, but the Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and the Kazakh, Uzbek, and Kyrgyz are languages more rooted in Turkic than in the Persian Farsi languages. Okay. So if those are the 15 republics, within Russia, there's a number of autonomous republics. I won't ask you to memorize those, but know, for example, when we come back up here, that Chechnya, Ossetia, Dagestan, these are autonomous republics. The Adagians, the Altais, Bashkortostan, Buryatia, Dagestan, Ingushutia, Kabardino-Balkaria, Kalmykia, Karachay-Cherkessia, Karelia, Komi, Mari, Eli, Mordovia, North Ossetia, Tatarstan, Tuva, Udmurtia, Khakassia, Chechnya, and Chuvash. These are kind of the 21 autonomous republics. And you hear that word autonomy, like you have some power over yourself. And so we've been talking about how the Soviet Union, says everyone's free, but as we've seen through collectivization and the purges, the terror, that freedom isn't lived on the ground. So what's going on here? And here, now I want to kind of get into the logic a little bit of Marxist Leninism. And let me, actually, I might even just turn off. Oh, I could show you a bit more about diversity here. Um, Let me see what this. Yeah, the capital of, just kind of fun fact, the capital of Tajikistan is Dushanbe, but it had previously been called Stalinabad, and as part of de-Stalinization, was renamed way out there in distant Tajikistan. Just kind of a quick look at the Islam and Islam in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation. It is an important demographic. 10 years ago, there were about 25 million Muslims in Russia, and it's a demographic that is having children at a higher rate. It is on the rise. In 1989, Muslims were maybe a fifth of the population in Russia. And this has long been part of the Russian Federation. I want to actually point out to you, Russia, in telling its history, Putin, in telling its history, often locates it in the conversion of the Viking Prince Volodymyr in Kiev to Christianity. I mean, he actually got, supposedly, the Chronicle tells us, was converted on Crimea and went back and then had a mass baptism of everyone in Kiev. By the way, Christianity is a religion where baptism happens individually, not in mass groups. There you have, but there you are. The and so Russia has long touted its Christian heritage, but know that on the Volga there was an Islamic kingdom of sorts in the Bulgars before Volodymyr down in Kiev embraced Christianity. The Volga, of course, was not part of Muscovy in these early centuries. They conquer Kazan in the 1550s, and then it takes them longer to kind of move down the Volga. But after that, the Volga is very much considered Russian heartland, the Volga River that flows down into the Caspian Sea, quite near Moscow, and then up towards the Baltics in that river system. But so know that this area that has long been considered Russian heartland has a Muslim polity on what became its territory before it has a Christianity there. So, and this map kind of gives you a quick look of kind of Islam in Eurasia and Africa. The vast majority of the Islamic population comes from the more Sunni tradition, and Shiites are more concentrated in Iran. But so in the Russian Empire, you have both of these traditions. Here's another picture of in 1979 in the Soviet Union, percentages of the Muslim population. And as you can see here, upwards in some of these Central Asian republics, you've got 70, 80% of the population are Muslim. And so many of you might be thinking, how did Islam play out in an atheist regime? Great questions. And I'd refer you to the work of historians like Paolo Sotori, who work on these very questions. The All right, well, here's a breakdown of kind of the different ethnic republics. When I listed that line of 21 different republics within Russia, what are their ethnicities? Short version, in large part, they're not Slavic, right? So on this map right here, you might say, okay, in what I see is yellow, and this is true more to the western parts of this map than the eastern parts of this map. But that yellow, you might think, okay, predominantly Slavic populations. And if it's the case in the eastern parts of the map, it's more due to migration, and how Russia, in large part, supplanted so many ethnic indigenous indigenous populations in the Far East that were always less kind of populous than the agricultural lands to the west. And in the 19th century, there's a concerted effort to send like 3 million Russians out into the Siberia and the Far East in what's known as the Great Migration. But note, if you read a Russian history book, and you can read mine, will tell you that it conquers Siberia in the 1580s, so the 16th century. But they don't really get lots and lots of people there until the 19th century. But even amongst all this kind of settlement of Russia, you still have really large parts of the population that aren't Russian. And so in this very unfree society, why do they why do they have any credence at all? Why didn't they just wipe them off the map? And here, this is where we're going to get into, just for our last couple minutes, a quick discussion of coming back to like Marxist Leninist theory on nationalities. And I'm gonna stop sharing there with you. Now, so if we come back to what we've learned about Marxist theory so far, is how Marx sort of says, there's all these institutions and things that prevent societies from fully realizing their potential and having a just, equal, happy society. And among those things are nations. That kind of this national identity is kind of a false construct. And so in a perfect, happy world that we want to arrive in, there won't be any national identities. And think about this sort of thinking. Like, one thing that is so prominent in our politics now is you hear the word global order, global government. Like, these people want to kill the nation. And I mean, it's kind of this crude slippage. But technically, in a socialist world, we're gonna, think John Lennon, imagine there's nothing that divides people. But these Marxism is also a very Hegelian philosophy. The idea is that all societies will pass through these stages. Marx has these 5 stages, but you have lots of Hegelians. You don't have to be a Marxist to be a Hegelian. And this idea that all societies pass through a certain amount of stages, and that having a sense of national identity is a necessary stage on the course of human development that there's no circumventing. And then you add this overlay of kind of Russian imperial chauvinism, that we have look out into our empire and we have all these more primitive people, and they put it in those sorts of, there's a civilizational hierarchy at work here. You have all these primitive people that what we need to do is cultivate their sense of nationality until they can advance through this stage, and then we can eliminate their sense of nationality. And so that's how we kind of make sense of this fairly contradictory notion. And you come back to this idea of the friendship of the peoples, right? That the friendship of the peoples, that we will be kind of separate, happy together as a necessary stage to get to a world where there aren't nationalities that divide people. Um, of course, it is. This is the rhetoric, and in large part, the reality on the ground is deeply, deeply coercive. In my empire course, we talk a good deal about that. But with that, we will end. And on Wednesday, our final lecture before our tests, we're going to talk about the Cold War. If you haven't given George Kennan's long telegram a good read, make sure you do, because I might not just lecture, but ask some questions too on Wednesday. Okay, have a good rest of the day.